4 years, two missing girls, and a husky who refused to stop listening. When Ellie Ward followed her dog Balto into the misty mountains of North Montana, she thought she was chasing a ghost. But what Balto uncovered wasn't a memory. It was a secret that someone buried deep inside the Blackwater Range. Hidden caves, silent footprints, a government program no one was meant to find, and a whisper that only a dog could hear. Stay with us, because this story will change the way you look at the wilderness and the people who hide inside it. If you believe in justice, courage, and the unbreakable bond between humans and their dogs, subscribe to our channel and help us tell stories that deserve to be heard. And let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? The first cold wind of October always hit Blackwater Range like a warning shot. Sharp, metallic, edged with the kind of silence only the northern Montana backcountry understood. The valley below Ellison Ward's cabin was drowned in blue dawn, pine silhouettes trembling in a fog that clung low and stubborn, as if the mountains were trying to suffocate the morning before it woke. Ellie Ward stood on her porch with a chipped mug of black coffee, staring at the unbroken wall of mist rolling through the ravine. Her hands were steady, but her jaw was locked, as if holding back words she hadn't spoken in years. The smell of wet timber, wood smoke, and frost drifted around her. It should have been peaceful, but peace was a language she no longer spoke. Behind her, the old pine boards creaked under the weight of something much lighter and much more alert. Balto, the half-wild, silver-coated husky she rescued from an abandoned shelter last winter, stepped out into the cold air. His fur bristled along his spine, ears pulled forward sharply, nose lifted to the wind like a radio antenna trying to lock onto a signal. "Easy, boy," Ellie whispered, knuckles tightening around her mug. "It's just the mountains waking up." But Balto didn't relax. The dog's rigid posture made her stomach knot. She'd seen him like this only twice before, once when a cougar circled the cabin at dusk, and once when a hiker had fallen into a crevice 2 miles east. Both times Balto's warning had been real, deadly real. He wasn't a typical pet. He was something else, something closer to a survival instrument than an animal. Half feral, half genius. The kind of dog who watched everything with unnerving intelligence, and now he was locked on something she couldn't see. "What is it?" Ellie whispered. Balto didn't break his stare. His breath shivered out in small, controlled exhales, frost drifting from his muzzle. Then, with a suddenness that cracked the quiet morning like lightning, he gave a sharp, guttural warning bark. Once, pause, twice. Ellie's blood iced. That bark pattern, one she hadn't heard in months, was the emergency code she taught him. Not for predators, not for wildlife, for human scent, human danger. "Balto," she breathed. The husky moved without hesitation, leaping off the porch and sprinting toward the tree line behind the cabin. His body was a streak of silver through the fog. Ellie swore under her breath, grabbed her coat, and took off after him. The forest swallowed her quickly, pines rising like cathedral pillars overhead, their branches dripping cold dew onto her hair and collar. The earth was soft, damp, laced with old needles and moss. Somewhere ahead she could hear Balto's paws pounding the ground, silent for a moment, then accelerating again, driven by instincts sharper than any human's. "Slow down," Ellie called, though she knew he wouldn't. Not when he was in this mode. The dog vanished behind a thicket of deadfall and wind-tangled brush. And by the time she shoved through the branches, Balto was rigid in front of a massive limestone outcrop. His body was low, muscles tense, tail stiff as a board. He growled, not frightened, but furious. Then Ellie saw it, the enormous stone slab leaning unnaturally against the ridge. It looked like a natural formation, but something about it felt wrong, like it had been placed, not formed. Balto scraped frantically at the ground beneath it, claws clicking against something that was not rock or soil. A sound reached her, a soft, papery scrape. Fabric. Ellie dropped to her knees and pulled back a clump of moss. And there it was, wedged between the stone and the ground. A tiny scarf, pale pink, frayed at the edges. Clean, too clean. Her breath caught in her throat. "No, that's not possible." She lifted it carefully. The scarf was damp with morning dew. But beneath the surface, it smelled faintly, impossibly of antiseptic cream. A medical-grade kind she hadn't used since her FEMA days. Something no wild child lost in the woods would ever have access to. Her throat tightened. This scarf didn't belong to any stranger. It belonged to Lily Harper, a 7-year-old girl who went missing with her older sister 4 years ago. Their disappearance had crippled the small community of Pine Bend, 20 miles south. The search had lasted months. Volunteers, dogs, helicopters, but the mountains never returned a single trace. Until now. Balto backed up and barked sharply, once again in the exact coded pattern discovery, human evidence, not an animal. Ellie stared at the scarf, her chest tightening as a wordless disbelief crawled up her spine. "It's been cleaned," she whispered. "Maintained." She pressed the soft fabric between her fingers. It wasn't rotten, sun-bleached, chewed, or frozen. It hadn't survived 4 winters out here. It hadn't been out here longer than a week. Ellie's stomach dropped. Someone had been caring for this, using antiseptic, keeping it intact. Someone had kept a child alive. A metallic sound echoed through the trees, distant but unmistakable, like metal touching metal, a latch resetting or a gate closing. Balto's head whipped toward the sound, his body pressed low, ready to sprint. Ellie rose to her feet slowly, her breath trembling. "No," she whispered. "Not again." She reached into her coat, fingers trembling, and tapped the emergency satellite device strapped beneath a flap in her vest. The button glowed red. A voice crackled seconds later. "Sophie Quinn speaking." "Soph!" Ellie swallowed. "I need you. At my cabin. Now!" There was a beat of silence. "You sound shaken. What did you find?" "Just come," Ellie said, "and bring your gear." She didn't wait for questions. She cut the transmission and looked down at Balto. The Husky stood completely still, his ice blue eyes locked on the ridge as if staring into the past or into the future. The wind shifted, rolling the fog against them in cold waves. Ellie clutched the pink scarf to her chest. 4 years ago, 2 little girls vanished from a parking lot. 4 years ago, the mountains consumed them without a trace. 4 years ago, the world stopped believing they were alive. But the mountains had lied, and now Balto the dog, who never barked without reason, had forced the truth into daylight. This wasn't an old death. This wasn't a forgotten ghost. This was a living story, a breathing child, a signal the mountains never meant to give back. "This is only the beginning," Ellie whispered. Balto didn't bark again. He didn't have to. The silence he left behind said everything. And it wasn't silence of peace. It was silence of a secret finally cracking open. The sun rose late in Blackwater Range, always slower than it should, as if reluctant to disturb whatever slept under the trees. But on this morning, the light didn't matter. Ellie Ward hadn't slept, not even for a minute. The scarf lay sealed inside a freezer bag on her kitchen table, its pink fabric pressed flat under the plastic, antiseptic scent trapped like a suffocating truth. Balto paced the floorboards restlessly, nails clicking softly, tail rigid, every circle tighter than the last. "You feel it too," Ellie whispered. Balto stopped pacing and lifted his head, eyes locked on the door as though something unseen stood behind it. His ears flicked back once, forward again. He was listening to something she couldn't hear, then a crunch of tires on gravel. Ellie exhaled. Sophie Quinn's black SUV emerged from the trees moments later, her silhouette sharp even through the windshield. Sophie was the kind of woman who carried authority without needing to speak. Ex-FEMA canine analyst, one of the best Ellie ever worked with, and the only person she trusted enough to call. When Sophie stepped out of the SUV, the cold air caught her breath in thin streams. Her short auburn hair was tucked beneath a wool beanie, and her gear bag swung from her shoulder with the weight of years of experience. "You dragged me 100 miles into the mountains before dawn," she said as she approached. "This better be—" Ellie didn't answer. She simply held out the freezer bag. Sophie froze the moment she saw it. "Where did you find this?" "Behind a limestone slab up on North Ridge," Ellie replied. "Balto found it." Sophie took the bag, lifted it to her nose, and inhaled carefully. Her jaw clenched. "This isn't weathered," she murmured, "and it's been treated with topical antiseptic. Recent. Ellie swallowed. 4 years, Soph. 4 years that kid's been gone. Someone kept her alive at least until recently, Sophie said. Balto growled low at the doorknob angrily, but tensely, like he recognized a danger returning. Sophie followed the sound. He's keyed up, she said. More than usual. Because there's more, Ellie said quietly. Come with me. They reached the ridge an hour later, the morning sun barely a weak smear behind thick gray clouds. Fog drifted through the trees like cold smoke, and the forest floor was soft enough to muffle even their footsteps. Balto led the way, weaving between trees with purposeful precision. That's not random tracking, Sophie said as she followed. He's triangulating. He heard something yesterday, Ellie said. Metal on metal. Under the ground. Sophie frowned. Under? Balto reached the limestone slab again and stopped. Tail straight, posture alert. He sniffed aggressively around the base, then barked once, a short, clipped sound that made the hair on Ellie's neck rise. Ellie knelt beside him and brushed aside moss and leaves, revealing the narrow gap where the scarf had been wedged. But this time, there was something else. Scratches. Dozens of them. Tiny, ragged lines carved into the stone with fingernails. Desperate, erratic, shallow enough to show weakness, deep enough to show effort. Sophie froze. Those aren't animal marks. No, Ellie whispered. They're not. A shiver rippled up her spine. She traced one scratch with her glove, following a line that curved clumsily before ending abruptly. Just beneath it, faint but unmistakable, was a letter, an L, or maybe half of an H. It's a name start, Sophie murmured. Child height, child strength. Balto suddenly started pacing, not aimlessly, but widening an invisible spiral, nose dipping to the ground, tail quivering with tension. Ellie stood slowly. What do you smell, boy? Balto stopped. Then he bolted. Balto! Ellie yelled, running after him. The husky tore through the underbrush, weaving between pine trunks until he reached a dense wall of mountain laurel. He let out a sharp, urgent bark, then began digging at a cluster of vines. Ellie pushed in beside him, hands ripping through layers of foliage. What she found made the world tilt. A fissure, barely 2 feet wide at the base, narrowing upward like a wound in the rock, but covered with such deliberate precision that no casual hiker would ever notice it. Someone had woven branches, matted moss, and dead leaves into a perfect camouflage screen. Sophie crouched down and tested the edges with gloved fingers. This isn't natural, she said. Someone placed every single piece. Balto pressed his muzzle into the crack and whined softly urgent, not fearful. There's airflow, Sophie said, holding a hand near the fissure. Warm, too. Something deep inside. Ellie leaned in close, placing her ear to the split. A faint hum, barely perceptible, like air passing through wooden beams or makeshift vents. A chill stiffened her spine. Someone built this. Balto growled, not loud but controlled, as if warning them and beckoning them at the same time. Sophie's voice dropped. If there's airflow and it's warm, that means someone went inside. Ellie swallowed. Or someone never came out. She reached for her headlamp, snapping it on. Sophie mirrored her. Together they widened the gap just enough to slide through. Balto slipped inside first, his body disappearing into darkness, like a ghost swallowed by stone. Ellie followed, then Sophie. The world became black instantly. The air changed, damp, sharp, rich with the smell of earth and something faintly metallic. The tunnel swallowed sound, compressing it into nothingness. Ellie's fingers brushed rough stone walls as she crawled forward. Dust lifted with every motion, swirling in the thin beams of their headlamps. 10 yards in, the tunnel widened. Balto stood in the center of a low chamber, his body rigid, tail stiff, nose pressed toward the ground. His ears twitched violently left, then right, then forward. Ellie smelled it then. Iron. Old but present, absorbed into the soil, not fresh but not ancient. Sophie crouched beside an uneven pile of fabric against the far wall. She lifted a piece pink flannel, faded with ash-colored stains, a torn sleeve. Then something glinted beside it, a small silver bracelet. Sophie lifted it free and held it to the light. The name was etched in uneven block letters. Lily. Ellie's chest constricted. "This is them," she whispered. "This is the Harper girls' hideout." "It's a shelter," Sophie said. "Improvised, reinforced. Someone put effort into making this livable." But Balto wasn't looking at the bracelet. He was staring at the far wall, growling softly. Ellie followed his gaze and saw it, a collapsed section of stone where roots dangled down like skeletal fingers. The wall there wasn't solid. It resonated faintly when she pressed her ear to it. "There's space behind this," she murmured. "A second chamber." Sophie tested the air near the crack. Engineered airflow. Vents between layers of rock. Someone designed this to support long-term use. Ellie stepped back. Her voice trembled when she spoke. "This wasn't an animal den. This wasn't a random cave." Balto pressed his head against her knee, signaling something with absolute clarity. Someone built this hideout. Someone put children here. Someone kept them alive. And that someone was still nearby. "Ellie," Sophie whispered, pointing toward the cave entrance. "Footprints." Ellie turned and saw them, fresh impressions in the thin layer of dust they hadn't disturbed. Small, bare, child-sized, heading deeper into the cave network. And beside them, heavy boot prints, adult-sized, leading out. Balto stiffened, his ears pulling back sharply. Something moved outside the cave. Something or someone watching them. Ellie felt the mountain close in around her, as if the stone itself held its breath. "We need to leave," Sophie whispered. "Now." Balto backed toward the exit, never breaking his stare at the trees outside. Ellie followed, her heart pounding so hard it drowned the sound of her own breath. As she emerged into the cold light, she scanned the forest, searching the shadows. Nothing. But the silence was wrong, staged, manipulated, observed. Sophie exhaled shakily. "This wasn't an abandoned site," she whispered. "This place is active. Someone's using it." Ellie looked down at the bracelet in her hand, gripping it so tightly the metal dug into her palm. The Harper girls had been gone 4 years, but now Ellie knew with sickening certainty they were not the only children taken into these mountains, and someone was still out here, guarding the secret. Balto stepped forward, his body suddenly still. Then he gave one single bark, sharp, deliberate, cutting through the cold like a blade. It wasn't a warning. It was confirmation. They were being watched, and the watcher wasn't done yet. The clouds sank low over Blackwater Range that afternoon, smothering the peaks in a heavy gray blanket that made the entire valley feel smaller, tighter, like a throat closing. Ellie Ward felt it before she saw anything, the shift in the air, the wrong stillness. Balto sensed it too. He walked at her side, tail low, every muscle tense, as if the forest itself had turned predatory. Sophie stood near the edge of the ridge, staring at the entrance to the hidden fissure. The vines they had pushed aside earlier now hung limp, as if someone or something had disturbed them after they left. "Ellie," Sophie murmured, "these branches, they were reset." Ellie's breath caught. "Reset?" "Rearranged." Someone tried to cover the entrance again. Sloppy, rushed but deliberate. Balto stiffened, head swinging sharply toward the trees. Then they heard it. A vehicle. Not the rumble of a truck or the clatter of an ATV. This one moved with the smooth confidence of an engine tuned to perfection. Government-level tuning. Moments later, a black SUV crested the hill, tires crunching slowly over the frost-hardened earth. On the side door, a thin, crisp logo that made Ellie's stomach drop. FBI. A man stepped out before the engine even died. Tall, composed, posture, too straight, too rehearsed. His charcoal hair was clipped short, his windbreaker marked with the unmistakable white block letters. Agent Clark Donovan. Ellie felt something cold thread through her ribs the moment she saw him. Balto growled, low not aggressively, but with unmistakable recognition of something wrong. Donovan scanned the landscape, lingering a second too long on Ellie. His eyes were the kind of unreadable blue that didn't reflect the environment around them. "Dr. Ellison Ward," he said as he approached. "Sophie Quinn." His voice was steady, the tone professional. warm enough to sound polite but cold enough to chill bone. "We received your report." "We didn't send a report," Ellie said flatly. "Someone did," Donovan replied with a faint smile. "Your sheriff called the regional office." Ellie's fists tightened. She imagined Hale panicked at the thought of old cases resurfacing, terrified someone might accuse him of incompetence, grabbing the phone the second she left town and calling the feds just to cover himself. Sophie gave Ellie a tiny shake of her head. "Let him talk first." Donovan gestured toward the ridge. "This area is now a federal investigation zone. We'll take it from here." "No," Ellie said before she could stop herself. "You don't even know what you're taking." Donovan turned his head slightly, studying her as if she were an unusual specimen. "I'm aware of the Harper case. Tragic." He lowered his eyes in false sympathy. "But the trail is ice cold. Allow us to collect the remains and close this chapter properly." "Remains?" Ellie asked sharply. He raised an eyebrow. "That is why you called us, isn't it?" "That scarf was clean," she snapped, "and treated. Recently, these kids weren't dead." "Were," he corrected gently, "until proven otherwise." Balto growled again, louder this time, stepping in front of Ellie as if shielding her. Donovan watched the dog with a flicker of irritation. "You should control your animal." Ellie's jaw tightened. Balto senses things people ignore. "Dogs also react to fear," Donovan replied. "Yours seems especially prone to projecting it." Sophie stepped forward. "Agent, with all due respect, Balto has located missing persons in 3 FEMA deployments, 2 state searches, and—" Donovan cut her off with a raised hand. "Your contributions are noted, but we have our own K-9 units. We don't need a civilian's pet." Balto's snarl was low, barely audible, but the sound vibrated through Ellie's bones. Then Donovan stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Dr. Ward, walk away. You've done enough." The word struck her like ice water. Walk away. The same phrase she'd heard 12 years ago when her son's case was handed over to higher authorities. The same phrase she'd obeyed then. Never again. Ellie stepped closer, voice steady. The Harper girls were alive. Someone cared for them. Someone brought them into those caves. "And someone," Donovan murmured, "doesn't want you poking around this mountain anymore." Something in his tone made Balto step backward, hackles raised, body rigid with instinctive distrust. And in that moment Ellie saw it, not in Donovan's expression, but behind it. He wasn't surprised the girls might be alive. He was annoyed. Annoyed they'd found something. Annoyed the mountains had given up a secret. Annoyed Ellie and Balto stood in his way. Sophie spoke quietly. "Agent Donovan, what exactly do you think happened here?" Donovan's smile was thin, cold. "A tragic accident, a case long closed, and 2 well-meaning civilians making noise where they shouldn't." Balto stiffened, nose swinging toward the trees again. A whisper of movement flickered in the shadows. Someone else was out there, observing, waiting. Donovan didn't look back, but Ellie saw his shoulders tighten. He knew someone was there, and he wasn't reacting like a man surprised. He reacted like a man whose partner had arrived. Ellie's heart pounded. "We're not done." "I'm afraid," Donovan said softly, "you are." They left him at the ridge, but his presence stayed behind like a stain on the air. Ellie and Sophie walked back toward the cabin with Balto leading, though his gait remained tense, ears swiveling as if reading danger on the wind. "Ellie," Sophie said quietly once they reached the porch, "there's more going on here than a simple kidnapping." "I know." Ellie rubbed a trembling hand through her hair. He was too rehearsed, too calm. "And he knew the girls weren't dead." Ellie nodded. "Balto knew something about him too. I've never seen him react that way." "Dogs recognize people who harm children," Sophie said, "even if they've never met them." Ellie felt her stomach drop. Before she could respond, Balto suddenly froze and stared toward the tree line behind the cabin. His ears shot up. His tail stiffened into a straight line. Then he barked, not once, not twice, but 3 times, rapidly, followed by a soft whine. Ellie's blood chilled. That was Balto's code for recent presence. Someone had been here, within minutes. Sophie pulled her flashlight, sweeping the ground. It didn't take long. Near a broad spruce tree, half covered by pine needles, lay a small object. Ellie knelt and brushed debris away. A child's shoe. Tiny. Mud-stained. But the mud was fresh. Balto sniffed the shoe, then immediately bolted downhill toward the thicker forest. Ellie and Sophie ran after him, hearts pounding. Balto skidded to a stop at the edge of a shallow creek. Ellie dropped to her knees. Footprints, small, bare, leading to the water. But on the bank across the creek, nothing. As if the child had vanished mid-step. Sophie exhaled shakily. This isn't natural. Ellie stared at the footprints disappearing into the water. And it wasn't the girl's choice. Movement flickered again in the trees. Balto turned sharply, barking once a warning this time. Sophie whispered, Ellie, whoever took those girls, they're still running this operation. Ellie didn't look at her. She couldn't. Her eyes were fixed on the empty bank across the creek. No, she whispered. They're not running. She lifted the small shoe, still warm from body heat. They're hunting. Balto stepped beside her, fur bristling, eyes locked on the ridge where Donovan had stood. The mountain had given Ellie truth, but it had also shown her something worse. Someone living in these woods knew exactly how to hide children, because they had done it before, and they were not finished. The storm rolled into Blackwater Range with an authority that made the pines tremble. Thick gray clouds clawed over the ridges, smothering the sky and flattening the world with cold mist. The mountains, once vast, now felt claustrophobic like walls closing around a secret that refused to stay buried. Ellie Ward stood in the center of the emergency staging outpost as floodlights hummed overhead. Radios crackled, medics rushed through narrow corridors, and the smell of diesel mixed with antiseptic hung thick in the air. Balto lay beside her on a padded mat, bandages wrapped around his shoulder, his breathing steady but shallow. Stay with me, boy, Ellie murmured, brushing a hand along his neck. You did everything right. Everything. Balto opened one ice-blue eye and nudged her wrist gently. Even injured, he tried to reassure her. That was who he was, always the one to calm, to steady, to lead. And today he had led them out of the darkest place Ellie had ever seen. Across the room, two girls sat wrapped in gray blankets, Peyton and Lily Harper. Their hair tangled, faces pale, movements small and hesitant. The older girl stared at everything with wide, wary eyes. The younger leaned into Ellie's jacket sleeve whenever she came close, like a child slowly remembering what safety felt like. They were alive, not unharmed, not unscarred, but alive. Sophie stood near the window, phone pressed to her ear. Her posture was rigid, her voice low and rapid. She'd been calling every contact she had from Homeland Security to child welfare, trying to protect the girls from disappearing into bureaucratic limbo. She didn't trust local authorities. She didn't trust regional ones either. And after what Ellie had learned, she didn't blame her. A soft knock sounded behind them. An agent stepped into the room, clearing his throat. Dr. Ward? Miss Quinn? They're starting the briefing. You're needed. Ellie nodded, giving Balto one last gentle touch before following Sophie into the conference room. The room buzzed with tension. Maps covered the table, red markers circling a web of underground pockets beneath the mountain. Dots indicated the cave systems Ellie and Sophie had passed through, yet now there were dozens more marked by thermal scans from the search drones. Dozens. Sophie's breath hitched. My God, this whole ridge is hollow. One of the federal analysts adjusted her glasses. Whoever constructed this had resources engineering, geological mapping, knowledge of old mining routes. These aren't random hideouts. They're structured. Organized, another agent added. Ellie's chest tightened. Which means this wasn't just one person? The room grew silent. Sophie stepped forward, tapping the map. Peyton and Lily didn't end up down there by accident. Someone maintained those spaces, ventilation, stored supplies, restricted exits. Someone who knew the terrain, Ellie said. Someone who could move children through it without detection. The lead investigator, Agent Mara Collins, folded her arms. Agent Donovan's communications devices have been seized. We found encrypted data on an unregistered drive. It links to a defunded federal initiative called Project Edenfall. Sophie's face hardened. I knew it. Ellie leaned in. What was it? Collins hesitated. Officially, a program meant to relocate at-risk minors from unstable homes to remote therapeutic environments. She paused. Unofficially, some documentation suggests unauthorized transfers. No oversight, no public record. And no return, Sophie added flatly. Ellie felt heat build behind her eyes. Not rage, not shock, but something colder. How many children? Collins inhaled. Confirmed missing, 11. Unconfirmed, likely more. A quiet dread sank into the room. Sophie whispered, the caves weren't just shelter. They were infrastructure. Not anymore, Collins said. We've launched raids on 2 shell organizations tied to Donovan. Warrants are being sealed as we speak, but this will take time. And what about the girls? Ellie asked softly. They'll be placed under protective supervision, Collins said. But they'll need a guardian for now, someone they trust. Ellie's jaw tightened. The girls had clung to her in the helicopter. They refused to sleep unless Balto was beside them. When medics tried to separate them for examination, they panicked until Ellie's voice steadied them. They trust her, Sophie said. She saved them. And Balto, Ellie whispered. Collins nodded. I'll file it. Night settled over the outpost in a heavy curtain. The wind beat against the windows, the storm pressing in as if desperate to swallow the building whole. Ellie sat on the floor beside Balto. Peyton slept nearby, curled beneath a blanket. Lily, awake and silent, leaned against Ellie's shoulder, tiny fingers gripping the edge of her sleeve. Ellie, the girl whispered. Yes, sweetheart? Is the man gone? Ellie hesitated. She thought of Agent Donovan's fall into the ravine, the way his silhouette had vanished into the mist. They didn't find a body, not yet, not in this storm. But she couldn't lie, not to a child who'd had lies forced on her for years. We're safe right now, Ellie said quietly, and we're going to stay safe. Lily nodded slowly, accepting the answer, not because she believed it, but because Ellie said it. Balto stirred, lifting his head to rest it on Ellie's knee. Lily reached out and placed her small hand on the dog's fur. You found us, she whispered, just like she said. Ellie blinked. Who said? Lily looked at her, eyes wide and dark. The other girl, before she left. Ellie's heartbeat stuttered. Another girl? Lily nodded. She said a silver dog would come, one who listens to things people don't hear. Balto nudged the girl gently, his eyes reflecting something ancient and fierce. Ellie swallowed hard. Do you know her name? Lily hesitated. Then softly, her name was Marin. Sophie, sitting across the room, froze mid-motion. Ellie whispered, but Marin didn't survive. They said she... Lily shook her head. She survived for a long time. Her voice shrank. Until they took her away. The storm groaned outside, rattling the window frames. Ellie closed her eyes. A name long buried in old case files now breathed again. A missing girl who'd been written off as a runaway. A child who hadn't run at all. Sophie whispered, Ellie, this isn't just about the Harper girls. No, Ellie said softly. It's bigger. Balto's ears flicked toward the door. A heavy silence fell. Sophie stood slowly. Did you hear? A knock, soft, measured, wrong. Ellie rose to her feet, pulling Lily behind her gently. Balto stood too, his injury slowing him, but not stopping him. His growl was barely audible, but every hair along his spine lifted. Sophie approached cautiously and opened the door just a crack. A uniformed officer stood outside, hat dripping rain, but Sophie's hand froze on the doorknob. The patch on his jacket wasn't local. It wasn't state. It wasn't federal. It wasn't anything. Ellie's voice dropped. Who are you? The man didn't answer. He glanced past Sophie, eyes scanning the room and landing on the girls. Balto lunged. Ellie grabbed his collar, pulling him back before he could strain his wound. The officer's expression remained blank, but he stepped away from the door. I was told to deliver a message, he said calmly. Tell Dr. Ward that not all chapters are meant to be opened. Sophie stiffened. Who sent you? The man tipped his hat. People who build these mountains. Then he turned and walked into the storm. Sophie slammed the door, bolting it. Ellie's heart hammered as she looked down at Balto. The husky pressed against her leg, body trembling, not from fear, but readiness. She knelt and held his head gently. This isn't over, she whispered. Balto blinked once, agreeing. Days passed. The investigation widened. Raids were conducted. Files emerged from long-buried servers. Testimonies were taken quietly, carefully. Donovan's involvement was undeniable, but he was only a middle piece in a machine older and darker than Ellie could comprehend. The girl stayed with Ellie in a protected home near the ranger station, an old building renovated with reinforced windows and constant surveillance. It wasn't perfect, but it was safe. Balto healed slowly. Each day he gained a little more strength. Each day he watched the tree line with old, knowing eyes. The girls laughed sometimes now, an uncertain sound, fragile as thawing ice. Ellie held on to every bit of it. Autumn came early that year. Leaves washed the mountainsides in gold and rust, and the air grew crisp enough to sting the lungs. Word spread slowly through Pine Bend stories about the rescue, the caves, the husky who saved 2 girls. And then came the students, 4 of them, high school journalism kids working on a documentary about mountain heroes. They climbed the trail to Ellie's cabin with oversized cameras and nervous smiles. Balto lay on the porch, watching them with that same old ancient calm. The tallest student cleared his throat. Ms. Ward, we wanted to ask something, if that's okay. Ellie closed her notebook. Sure. The boy hesitated. Why stay here? After everything? The girls are safe. The bad people are caught. Why not go somewhere quieter? Ellie looked out into Blackwater Range, the forest that once swallowed children and now hummed with the soft murmur of wind. She looked at Balto, lying exactly where he chose to be, head lifted toward the trees. She understood the answer only because he taught it to her. Because, Ellie said softly, he still hears things we don't, and someone has to listen with him. Balto lifted his head, ears pricked, body still, then one single bark. Not a warning, not a cry, a reminder. Somewhere in those mountains a whisper still waited to be heard, and Balto would never stop listening, neither would she.